Hello everybody. Recently I got in touch with Nissan UK and asked if we could perhaps work together. Happily they got back to me and said they'd be utterly delighted. What is it that I would like to take? Now, I think it might surprise a few people because the first thing that I asked for was this, a Nissan Leaf. Now there are a few reasons I asked for the Leaf. Number one, I do actually enjoy having electric cars on the driveway. I had a big journey planned that I would have appreciated saving some fuel on, so I thought, you know what, it's the perfect time to test out another electric car and see just how the EV marketplace is changing, because every time I get in an electric car, things seem to have changed quite a bit. Some ways it gets easier, some ways it gets more difficult, and I've discussed that in a few videos in the past. The Leaf is also an interesting vehicle because it was one of the EVs that really was sort of first to market. This car has been in one form or another around for about 10 years now. It's in its second generation, which was introduced in 2017, but it's still in many ways quite similar to the original 2010 car. There's a lot about the Leaf which is good, and there's a lot about the Leaf which perhaps could be better. And so this is going to be a two-part video. In this first part, we're going to look at the car, talk you through the specs, configurations, all that sort of stuff, and what it's like to drive. And then the next part is going to be delivered at the end of my week with the car, where I'm going to talk about how it's been to live with and drive as an electric car for someone that's doing this week quite a few miles, well over 1,000 in fact. So the Leaf, well, to look at it, it's actually a very sort of ordinary car, and I say that with some surprise because a lot of manufacturers try and make their electric cars sort of stand out, and barring some sort of odd stuff on the front grille, there really isn't that much about the Leaf that stands out. And if you took all the badges off of it, I don't think people would really realise that it was even an electric car. And indeed, there's actually quite a few things about the Leaf that I think Nissan have got absolutely completely right. First off, it's got a reasonable range. This car has a 62 kilowatt hour battery. This is the Leaf E Plus model, which has been recently introduced, and it gives you up to about a 240 mile range. In practice, the car suggested to me that real world range is going to be just over 200 miles, placing it a little bit shy of the Kia e-Niro. Now, the e-Niro is an important rival. It's similar in price, with the e-Niro actually being a little bit less than this one. And of course, the e-Niro is basically an all-new car, has won a raft of awards, whereas the Leaf is a creaky old beast that's trying to stay relevant in the modern world. There are signs of the Leaf's age all around it. For example, this cabin is one of the least coherent that I've ever been in. It's absolutely bizarre. You've got leather, you've got vinyl, you've got plastic, you've got dark, you've got light, there's bits of blue in it. It's all a bit random. You have, for example, this really space age looking gear selector down here, and then the most horrible, nasty old buttons and switches here, which I've recognised from cars in the Nissan range that are indeed a decade old. The screens up here, you've got a regular analog dial for your speedo, which seems, again, very out of place in an electric car because they're often the one where manufacturers chuck all their tech. And then you've got a sort of big LCD that's very incongruously placed next to it, which gives you all of your other information. Over here, you've got a fairly traditional screen, which is also very low resolution and not particularly bright, and just feels, well, very last gen. However, there are a lot of key things that Nissan get absolutely spot on with this car, which many other automakers don't. It feels, from the driver's seat, just about the right size, and if you look at it, it does just look like sort of normal hatchback-sized car. That engine gives you 217 horsepower and about 340 newton meters of torque, and as is traditional with electric cars, that torque is delivered very readily, very happily, and this is a pretty nippy car. If you imagine that many people coming to one of these might be replacing their normal eco runabout, and so are probably used to something like perhaps a 1.6 litre petrol or diesel, or maybe even less, this is going to feel very quick. If you're a young driver, this is a fast car. It also rides really nicely. The last long-term loan car that I had was a Kia Sportage, and that's just too firm. The steering's actually got a really pleasant weight to it as well, and actually means this car is kind of fun to hustle. No, it's not especially quick. The brakes need a lot more work than you would think, but it is fun nonetheless. There's also a surprising amount of room in the boot. That's often where a lot of EVs can suffer, and even some hybrids, like for example the Lexus CT200H. That's absolutely tragic for boot space, whereas this thing's magnificent. The only real issue is there's actually quite a big lip. I presume perhaps there used to be maybe a spare wheel compartment in the original design or something, because that boot really goes quite far down when you look into it. Loads of space in there, very, very good. The only thing you've got in there that's making life a little bit difficult is a Bose subwoofer. Not really sure what that subwoofer does, because the sound system in here is sort of average. It's all right. If you told me it was the standard sound system, I would believe you. You do have heated seats all round, and the button for the heated seats in the back is in the strangest place I've ever seen it. So that is all a bit unusual. When you consider the price point of this car, near as makes no difference, £36,000, and some of these things are a little bit unforgivable. I mean, I like in this Techno trim the sort of bits of leather and leatherish that are in the car, and these seats are very comfortable. The Techno level brings you a few different things in this car. For example, it's got better alloy wheels, you know, the trim level in here is a result of that. And you also get Nissan's Pro Pilot, which is something I'm going to be experimenting with in the next week or so. The other thing I need to talk about in part 2 is the big Achilles heel of the Leaf. You see, the Leaf's battery pack is only air cooled, and that's significant. If you weren't aware, nearly every single electric car manufacturer out there has active liquid cooling for their battery packs, and that's very important because in order to maintain a battery and keep it in best condition for as long as possible, temperature is important. It needs to be kept warm enough, or where appropriate, cool enough. When you charge a battery quickly or you're pressing on hard, it's going to get warm. That is what is responsible for reducing battery life. You ever felt how hot your mobile phone gets when it charges? Well, imagine how hot these things must get. Now, apparently, this was a big problem, certainly in the old cars with the 40 kilowatt hour battery, which had a shorter range. You get essentially one rapid DC charge okay, but after that, the car will start throttling down the power that it'll take to try and preserve the battery life. England isn't exactly a hot country, and I believe that there will be other places around the world, Texas for example, where that would be much more of an issue. So I'm going to be interested to see just how bad it is here, because there will be days when I'm doing more than one rapid charge. Another sign of the Leaf's age is the fact that it uses the old shadow mode connector, which a few manufacturers, particularly Asian ones, seem to use when electric cars were a newish thing, but now most of the others have moved over to the Type 2 or CCS connector. Whenever I have an electric car for review, there's one thing that keeps cropping up in the comments section, and that's people talking about the longevity of these vehicles. Now, I tend to get annoyed at those comments, I'll be very honest about that, because most people don't really tend to keep combustion engine cars for that long either. And the Leaf presents me with an interesting dilemma. Driving this car, it feels, even though this is a brand new vehicle, pretty out of date. And the platform it's based on is only 10 years old. Now, it's not the way it drives that feels out of date or anything like that. The motor tech and all that stuff, I get aside from the battery, is all pretty modern, is all pretty decent. But it's sat-nav screens, things like that. And as we keep filling our cars with more technology, all this stuff, they're going to become out of date at an increasingly rapid pace. And so everyone keeps talking about how we can try and keep these cars on the road for longer. But I actually think perhaps we're looking at it the wrong way round. Maybe the focus needs to be not so much on keeping cars on the road for as long as we possibly can, but on making recycling them even easier and even better, especially when it comes to things like battery tech and so on and so forth. We have on this planet very limited resources, and something that keeps cropping up and something I want to do more research about is just how easy it's going to be to turn the entire world's vehicle supply into electric vehicles. The simple fact is that most people, when a car gets to 10 years old, they kind of lose interest. Now, in some ways, that is a very British thing, because there's a lot of places around the world where they are much better at keeping cars going for longer. But the simple fact is that also, and this is a global thing, governments are trying to make it harder for you to own older cars, because they don't want you having old polluting vehicles. For example, if you have a diesel that's any more than about 3 years old, you're going to be penalised for driving it into central London. That's a vehicle that is essentially brand new. So perhaps when it comes to cars, we need to stop worrying about making them last and start making it easy to just be economically and environmentally sustainable when it comes to the car's end of life. I know that manufacturers will all have a plan for that. I'm convinced that they do. In fact, I believe they're legally required to do so. But I think it's not so clear for the end user what to do, and it would be nice to see cars now being advertised as saying, you want to buy the new Leaf, it's 90% recycled. It would really be nice in future to say, by the way, your car is now 80% recycled. That, I think, would be good. That would be interesting, and I think that is actually the sort of thing that might be more important to car buyers in the future, because, well, I'd like to see that as well. Even for traditional combustion engine vehicles, it's nice to know that your car is being sustainably produced, because I'm not actually a great believer that the CO2 that a vehicle produces is what we need to be demonising, more the CO2 involved in its production. However, first impressions of the Leaf are, things noted already aside, quite positive. So I'm looking forward to my time with it, and I hope you'll all join me for part 2 in about a week or so. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.